was August 2 years ago when we started the book of Acts. So if I can drag this 28th chapter out a couple of months, we can say we did 2 years, the book of Acts. But I won't do that to you. Not because I couldn't drag it out, but I don't think that's God's design. This is an interesting ending. Have you ever looked at the way books end? Particularly the books of the New Testament. They have some interesting endings. There's in a sense, like Alfred Hitchcock endings. That's the book of Jonah. Nobody expects the book of Jonah to end that way. Here's the preacher who has preached and people listen. What an unusual thing. I mean, they repent. And here's the preacher whining. Because he was hoping to sit outside the city and watch God destroy the Ninevites. And God didn't do it. I mean, that's an Alfred Hitchcock ending. Right? The books of the Bible have some unusual endings. And sometimes, because we haven't understood the context of the book, we don't get the ending. As we come to the 28th chapter of the book of Acts, we've got another unusual ending. I mean, this book has been building. It's building to a crescendo. The sovereign God of the universe is going to take his man to stand before Caesar and declare the glories of Christ. And the book ends and he's not there. I mean, we have been working. He is going to get to Rome. Nothing's going to stop him. Not soldiers, not sailors, not storms, not snakes, not sickness. He's going to get to Rome. And he gets to Rome, and there's no 29th chapter. We don't get him preaching to the Caesar. Exactly the way God ordained it to be. One of the interesting questions we have to ask ourselves is, why is it that as we read this account of the establishment of the church in its first generation, why is it that we see so much personal interaction and so little preaching? Why is it we have this saga of Paul's encounters with all of these people and how he responds and all this historical narrative, but we don't have Paul standing before them and preaching? I mean, we come to this 28th chapter, and we now have this captive audience, literally 276 men. Paul says, you're going into the sea, the boat's going to be destroyed, you're all going to live. They get to the island, somebody says, hey, I wonder if he was right, and they count. 276. Where do you think they're looking? But no account of Paul preaching to them. Paul goes and gathers sticks, brings them back to light a fire, gets bit by a snake, and there's heathen there, we'll see them. And they're like, oh yeah, yep, he's done. And he's not done. Shakes the snake, shakes the snake off into the fire. And they're like, 1, 2, 3, 4. And they go from, the gods are out to get him, he's a murderer, to, he's a god. Do you think in that scenario Paul said anything? I'm guessing, knowing Paul, yeah, he did. And God guides them. They end up on the shore near the lands of Publius. Here they are on the island of Malta, and it's a heathen island that's filled with those who are superstitious, but Rome has a hold there, and they come, and where do they wreck? Right next to Publius's land. And lo and behold, Publius's father is dying. And Paul is there. How does the guy who's on the boat as a prisoner get access to Publius's father who's dying? Who do you think brought Paul's name up? You know what? We don't know a whole lot, but you might talk to that guy. And he goes in, and God heals the man. And so what happens? Word spreads throughout the whole land, and everybody brings their sick, and they all get healed. Do you think in that context that Paul preached to them? But we have no record of the preaching. Why? Because I believe as we come to the end of this book and the end of the establishment of the church, God is going to put a premium on testimony. People do not care how much you know until they know how much you care. And that was true even of the Apostle Paul. The title of my message today is Of Storms, Sticks, Snakes, Sickness, and Such. And that's just because I didn't know how else to get it into a title. So I just put everything that was in there. No, really, no. I hope you get the impact. I mean, storms, sticks, snakes, sickness. And is there any more? Have you, I guess, subtitle, enough is enough. Ever felt that way? Enough is enough. That's the scenario Paul finds himself in. You follow along. I'm going to begin Acts chapter 28. I'll begin in verse 1. And when they were escaped, then they knew that the island was called Melita. And the barbarous people showed us no little kindness, for they kindled a fire and received us everyone because of the present rain and because of the cold. And when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, there came a viper out of the heat and fastened on his hand. And when the barbarians saw the venomous beast hang on his hand, they said among themselves, no doubt this man is a murderer, whom though he hath escaped the sea, yet vengeance suffereth not to live. And he shook off the beast into the fire and felt no harm. Howbeit they looked, when he should have swollen or fallen down dead suddenly. But after they had looked a great while and saw no harm come to him, they changed their minds. I love that. Oops, guess we got it wrong. And said that he was a god. In the same quarters were possessions of the chief man of the island, whose name was Publius, who received us and lodged us 3 days courteously. And it came to pass that the father of Publius lay sick of a fever and of a bloody flux, to whom Paul entered in and prayed and laid his hands on him and healed him. So when this was done, others also which had diseases in the island came and were healed, who also honored us with many honors. And when we departed, they laded us with such things as were necessary. Let me ask you a question. If you're a sailor on that boat that's just gone through shipwreck, and it starts with Paul telling you exactly what is going to happen, and all of a sudden you find yourself on a desert island, and out of the woods come running barbarians, what are you thinking? Somebody's having lunch. But it's probably not me. And at the end of that, they end up getting to go stay in the chief man. They're going to the governor's mansion for 3 days. And when they're leaving, they lavish them with gifts. And all of it is because of this man on that boat who starts out as a prisoner that nobody even wants to talk to. The power of testimony. So let's look at Paul's life. First of all, we're going to start with storms. Storm. We tend to think they're all safe on shore and everything's good, right? Well, no. Okay, they just survived the sea. And remember the setting before this happens. Paul prayed, they had a little snack, and then it was like, okay, boys, time to go into the ocean. I mean, they haven't eaten in 14 days. They've been throwing everything that was non-essential overboard. They're starving, they're hungry, and there's still a storm. The wind is still blowing, the waves are still crashing. They head in a furious motion to do that which they know will destroy their ship. Running aground nose first, knowing that this tempestuous sea is going to tear the ocean apart. Now, understand, folks, what they're talking about. They're out there, they're probably on the south side of the island of Malta. I had the privilege back in 1993 to get to go on board the USS Eisenhower. It's a nuclear aircraft carrier. It had just come back into port at Newport News. I got to go on and spend a day on the ship. The reason it was back in port is it had just returned from the Mediterranean. It was out in the middle of the Mediterranean, got caught in a storm. The USS Eisenhower's flight deck, it's an aircraft carrier, is 90 feet, 9 stories above the surface of the water. While it was in the storm, a rogue wave washed over the ship, washing 4 sailors and 3 airplanes off the deck. That's the sea we're talking about. These guys literally have been fighting this storm for weeks. It's a huge storm. They run aground, they bail into the sea, knowing this, some of them can't swim. Paul, we're going to jump in. What do those of us who don't swim do? Grab a board. That's literally what he says to them. By the way, if you can't swim, grab a piece of something and float in. We'll see you when you get there. They get to shore, and the storm's still howling, folks. The waves are still raging. The wind is still blowing. And they now have nothing. No shelter, no protection. They're soaking wet. Some of them are probably spewing up the salt water which they've just imbibed. They are in difficult circumstances. Storm. Life is filled with storm. There are personal storms in people's lives. The unexpected things that happen. The things that happened we hadn't planned on, or maybe even worse, the things we don't have a plan for. There are things that happen that we hadn't planned on, but we can deal with those. They're unexpected, but somehow we work it out. The worst are the things we don't have a plan for. Storms. There are national storms, aren't there? This week we faced another terror attack, didn't we? While it was personally devastating for those who lost loved ones, it was a storm for our nation as, again, we faced the reality of our vulnerability. We are not as secure as we thought we were. The question is this: how do we respond when the storms of life come? And they will come. How did Paul respond? Claimed the promises of God. Trusted that God will always be faithful to His word. Notice, God said that no one would die, but He didn't say that it was going to be comfortable. God didn't say, you know what, you're going to be put in a bubble. For you, the wind won't be cold, the water won't be wet, the sand won't be chafing. For you, you won't miraculously be hungry. But you know what? Sometimes whenever God is at work in the circumstances of life, that's what we tend to think. I remember a time having to discipline a child. Correction. And in talking with that child, I was very loving. We had a great conversation. We talked through the scenario. We laughed a little. And at the end, it was time for correction. And they didn't understand that. What? Well, why? Well, remember we had this long conversation about what you did wrong. You need to learn not to do wrong. Well, yeah, but... And you know, there's sometimes that's almost our reaction to God. In the midst of the circumstances of life, we have this thought that it's never going to hurt. It's never going to be difficult. It's never going to be uncomfortable. But the reality of it is, folks, we'll never truly appreciate the grace of God in the midst of the storms of life until we realize that He does not just take us away from them. He walks through them with us. He trusted God's promises. Notice that we don't have any record of Paul whining and complaining. It was he that wrote, "Do all things without murmurings and disputing." I believe that Paul was conscious of his testimony before all those who were now watching him. He told them what God had said and what God would do. And he demonstrated confidence in God in the big things. But what would he do now when things aren't comfortable? Remember, he was going to Rome to stand trial for false charges. He had already been tried twice and cleared, but was still facing trial. Could he not even just have a normal boat ride on the Mediterranean to stand trial? I mean, couldn't he just have just a nice little Mediterranean cruise on the way up to Rome? God, is that too much to ask? I mean, from the human perspective, there seems to be at least a little bit of a sense in which he had the right to complain just a little. I mean, isn't enough enough? But what would the sailors have thought? What would all those soldiers who were watching him have thought? Let's think for a minute. I think we do a pretty good job at declaring the big truth about God. The gospel. His sovereign control of the affairs of men. His holiness. His standards. And don't mistake me, we should. Here's the question. What does our life in the everyday storms of life say about that God when we face personal difficulty? Do we whine? Do we complain? Do we live as though God doesn't exist or isn't fair? Because people are watching. And you know what? That's the sound they hear. Much more than your declaration of the big thing. Storms. Sticks. Sticks. You know, I studied this historically. Critical scholarship says, this account is made up. Luke made this up. Because we know, going to Malta, there are no trees. Well, used to be there was no... today, there's no trees really in Haiti. But you go back and read a little history, and the mahogany trade on the island of Haiti produced more wealth for France under Napoleon than the rest of the New World did for all of Spain and all of England. Just the trees from Haiti. So the fact that there are no trees today doesn't mean that there never were trees. That's the first thing. But no one here says Paul goes and gets sticks from trees. He gathered a bundle of sticks. Probably the wreckage from the boat. Gathered sticks. Why is that significant? Well, it's significant first because we have a conscientious servant. When you study the context of him gathering sticks, it was a menial task. We don't know if everybody gathered sticks. They might have, but this we know. Paul gathered sticks. And it was not the stuff that people of dignity would have done. In fact, in third world cultures, it was the designated task of those who were seen as being in menial positions. They went out and gathered sticks. That's what they did. Here's Paul. And what's he doing? People are cold. People are fearful. People are suffering. People are scared. And Paul looks on their need. And he goes and gathers sticks to keep a fire going. He was going to make a practical difference. He was going to do something to be a tangible blessing. He wanted to do something to communicate his love. Sticks don't seem all that important, do they? But understand this. He was a conscientious servant. Are you? You can see the picture. What would you do in that? I don't know. I don't know what I would do in that. Paul looked at that and he said, you know what? I don't know what else we can do, but I can keep the fire going. I'm going to do something. What are you doing in a world that is constantly being bombarded by storms? When all we do is sit around and whine and complain, you know what we're telling that world? You're right, there isn't a God. This is chance. This is fate. This is bad luck. Do something. Do something. He was a conscientious servant. Paul could have sat back in his arrogance and said, see, I told you so. Should have listened to me from the beginning. Sadly, in a decaying culture, folks, that is becoming the most pronounced message of those who have the truth. See? Told you so. Who cares if you told them so? What should we be telling them? Declare the grace of God. Declare the mercy of God. Declare the love of God. Declare the sovereignty of God and demonstrate it through doing something. What are you doing? Because when we look at sticks, we don't just see a conscientious servant. You know what we see? We see a curious crowd. Somebody's watching. The sailors are watching, the soldiers are watching, and the barbarians are watching. We don't know why they're watching him. But they're watching. They're watching the whole scenario play out because they're very conscious of the fact when he gets bit by a snake. They're watching Paul. Folks, people are watching. Your testimony matters. It is the context in which God wants the gospel presented in your sphere of influence. People are watching. And they're curious. Oh, they may start out skeptical. Let's watch this one. But they're watching. What is your life saying? Sticks. He went and gathered sticks. He decided to keep the fire going. He's caring for people. People who are transporting him to be put on trial. Stop for a minute. The sailors, when it's time for them to abandon ship, they say, kill these guys. We need to get rid of these guys. And it's only because the centurion says, no, we're not killing Paul, that he's not killed. And they jump into the sea, and because of Paul, God delivers them. He says, I've given all of these into your hand. God delivers them, and they get on shore. Don't separate this because we had a Sunday in the middle. They jump into the sea after just having said, let's kill this guy, and they make their way to the shore, and they're cold, and they're hungry, and they're wet, and they still just wanted to kill him. And Paul says, you know what, let me get some sticks for the fire to keep you warm. Ask you a question. How do you respond to your enemy? And what does it say about your God? Because it does say something. Sticks. Enough is enough, right? Snakes. I mean, really? The boat goes down? There's a storm? We're hungry? I mean, not that there's ever a good time to get bit by a snake, but really? I mean, I'm getting a little firewood. Shawam! Snakes. I think you know the encounter I had with a snake in our garage. I don't like snakes. In fact, gained quite an aversion for all reptiles. I was chasing one at 11:15 last night with a skimmer net in my pool because my dog was barking at it. I don't like reptiles. I did learn how fast a big frog can swim, and he covered my pool in no time. Here's Paul. He comes out to do this good deed for men, to demonstrate love toward them, and swam. Now understand, these barbarians know they're snakes. Okay? It wasn't, ooh, let's watch him and see whether or not this is a poisonous one. No, they knew what kind of snake it was. They're expecting him to fall over dead. So notice, in the light of snakes, the superstition of men. Aha! Now we know what's going on. He's a heathen criminal. He's a murderer. And the gods are going to judge him. You know, sometimes we live with that mindset of retribution theology. Do you know that that's the only place where religion leaves men? It's only the grace of God that makes that different. You get what you deserve. You get what's going around. That's the way life is. Those are all atheistic statements. There's a God in heaven who works all things together for good to them that love him and to those who are the called according to his purpose and in his sovereign plan. Paul needed a snake bite. They're watching. I just, I'd love to see it. Oh! He shakes it off into the fire. Probably keeps putting sticks on. I mean, what do you do after that? I mean, I know what I'm doing. It's going up and I'm running. Woo! Woo! Either that or I look for my wife. Babe! Babe! In our house, if my babe doesn't panic, I'm good. I'm not dying. She's a nurse. She panics. Knock me out. Do something. But anyway. I mean, what do you do after that? I don't know what you do after that. But I know this. They break out the popcorn. This is the show. Let's watch this guy. Any bets? How long do you think it's going to take for him to swell up? I mean, they're watching. He's going to swell. How does Luke know that? Right? He's writing this. Somebody's obviously talking. Hey, buddy, you know what? This is the way that one goes over there. He's got like 4 steps and he's falling over. Watch. And they're watching. And I want you to see in the midst of the superstition of men, whenever they encounter this snake, I want you to see the sovereignty of God. Hear me, friends. Storms, snakes, sickness, and such can never stop the will of God in your life. When was the last time you dared anything significant for God? Paul was untouchable. He was going to Rome. Snake bit him. He didn't think, oh, there it is, I'm dead now. No. Why? Because God had showed up on this boat and said, by the way, the boat's going down. But no, he didn't tell him about the snake. But he just said, just know, you're going to Rome. He trusted God. So I don't know if he got bit, shook him off, whistled on him. I don't know what he did. But all I know is this. In the sovereignty of God, a snake couldn't kill him. Because he had a purpose to fulfill. Now, it could be that purpose was over and he could have killed him if we didn't know about Rome. I'm not here to tell you when you're going to die or how. All I know is this. If you will serve the sovereign God of the universe, you will not die 1 second before he's ready to bring you to heaven. By the way, you won't live 1 second longer either. So why do we whine and complain? Why do we live in fear? Why do we profess to a world that the circumstances are all dependent on us and live under a cloud? Why don't we attempt great things for God? Sovereignty of God. And that leads us to the last chapter, sickness. Sickness. We see a great Gentile. But he was vulnerable. His father was dying. There wasn't a thing he could do about it. And I don't know through the working of God how it gets to be Paul, but probably, hey, you know what? Here's this guy. He knows 276 men are going into the sea and they're not going to die. And they didn't. And he gets bit by snakes and he doesn't die. You know what? You might talk to him. And he goes and he shows compassion and he prays and he lays hands on him and he's healed. And you know what? This great Gentile comes to realize there's a great God. That's what Paul's life kept saying over and over and over again. I serve a great God. No matter what my circumstances look like. No matter if it's storms, sticks, snakes, sickness, or such. I serve a great God. And he makes no mistakes. And I trust him. And you need to. His life preached the greatest message ever preached. Power of testimony. Let me ask you this question. How's yours?